Hi, and welcome back to TikTok Tuesday. So this week we're talking about the myths, the misrepresentations and misconceptions, and the stereotypes surrounding Tourette syndrome that has led to a stigma surrounding Tourette syndrome today. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the biggest misconception of them all, because I have a lot to say about it. That is, everybody with Tourette syndrome swears, cusses, curses, says bad words, shouts obscenities. This is not true. So we know that this is called coprolalia and that it only affects 10% of people who have Tourette syndrome. For my capstone paper, I'm writing the history of stigma and Tourette syndrome, tracing back over 100 years of articles and research. And it goes all the way back. Well, we don't technically know how far it actually goes back, but as far back as we do know, Dr. Gilles de la Tourette, who's the founder. You could say he's the guy who coined Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome was named after him for his famous article, and he was French, and it's a long title written in French that I can't pronounce. I barely got through trying to say his name. So he published an article in 1885 studying 9 patients. A few of them he didn't actually study. This was an international study in a very small sample size, 9 people. 5 of them exhibited coprolalias, 55%. And because of that, he insinuated that coprolalia is the hallmark of Tourette syndrome. We know now that this is not true. In fact, he said that in order to be diagnosed, you had to have Tourette syndrome, which means that a lot of people have gone undiagnosed in the past. And I guess even worse than that, Tourette syndrome was also associated with demonic possession and the assumption that people need to be exorcised, just a lot of bad rep. And then there's another article that I referenced in my paper published in 1973 where they redefined Tourette syndrome. And then I think another one in 1984 where they said that coprolalia affects 1/3 to 1/2. I believe. Anyway, it's diminished a little bit more since then. So now we know that it only affects 10% of people who have Tourette syndrome. So yes, there are people that swear, well, consciously, but involuntarily as well. Anyway, so that is the biggest misconception that everyone associates with, that the media is bad representation of it, but we are progressing, we're moving forward. And who knows, maybe in the next 100 years, it'll change. We never know. So our next myth is that Tourette syndrome is rare. So Tourette syndrome is not as rare as people think it is. So of the U.S. Census, Tourette syndrome affects 3% of that population, of the United States. To compare, out of the global population, so everybody in the world, the 7 billion people of the world, 2% of all the people in the world have green eyes. Hi. My green eyes are rarer than my Tourette's, which I thought was very interesting. I have another statistic that I wanted to bring up too, because I also going back and forth and talking about like the media representation. So I know I'm trying to be not, what's the word? Problematic. So I know right now gender dysphoria, or being transgender, is a big topic in the news right now in the media. And it's getting a lot of representation, good and bad. So gender dysphoria, this is a percentage of the entire global population as well, affects less than 1%, like way less than 1% of people. So people who actually have diagnosed gender dysphoria, it's around 0.002% and 0.014%. Very small. But yet we hear a lot about those people and not so much about Tourette syndrome, even though there are far more people with Tourette syndrome. And that again goes back to just the representation and what's in the news and what's not being talked about. And Tourette syndrome isn't talked about as much. Now that Motherless Brooklyn has come out, and Billie Eilish and other people, Samuel J. Comroe, talking more about Tourette syndrome, it's bringing the disorder to light, and that makes me very happy because it means that we can get again a better accurate representation and the stigma will decrease. Anyway, that's just a progressive movement to me, and it makes me happy. But of course, there's always going to be stereotypes, so here I am addressing them, trying to knock them down. So next we have everyone who tics has Tourette syndrome. That is not true. So I know it's not uncommon for children to tic. Normally they can have like stressor tics, nervous tics, but that doesn't mean they have a tic disorder. And if you do have a tic disorder, that doesn't mean you have Tourette syndrome. It depends on how long it persists and how many tics you have, whether it's chronic or not. And I know I've talked about that in the past, so I'm not going to get too detailed on that. I think that was the first episode I did, actually. So after that, we have people can control their tics if they really wanted to. So that is not true. Tourette syndrome is literally a neurological disorder marked by involuntary movements and vocalizations. Those are what tics are. You can't control them. But after this, I'm trying to go down in a linear path here. Next, it's easy to point out people with Tourette syndrome because of their tics. It's easy to find people who have tics, who have Tourette syndrome, blah, blah, blah. That's not true. Because, well, it can't be. It's a myth because, look at me. I know I have Tourette syndrome, but I have learned to suppress my tics. And a lot of people have learned to suppress their tics. Even though they are involuntary, if you don't see them, doesn't mean they're not there. That's actually the next one. I've got ahead of myself. So the myth, if tics are not present, the person must be doing better or no longer have Tourette syndrome or tics. That is not true at all. Just because you don't see someone ticking does not mean they don't have Tourette syndrome anymore, or that they're doing better, or that they're lying. None of that. It just means that they have a better control, or maybe they're not in a highly stressed situation. There's a number of reasons someone could just not be ticking at that very moment. Could be due to, again, therapy or medication, or just a state of being. So no, it doesn't mean that they're no longer there. They are. So my next one is that the only problem that people who have Tourette syndrome has are tics. That's the only problem associated with Tourette syndrome. And we know that this is not true because a number of comorbid disorders are highly associated with Tourette syndrome. I've talked in the past, OCD, ADHD, all that, rage, inhibition. So yeah, all the comorbid disorders. My next misconception is that a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome can be traumatic or catastrophic. Not really. Personally, for me, it was a sign of relief, and that's pretty common, actually. Knowing your diagnosis can help alleviate the feeling of what's wrong with me. Mainly for me, especially. Knowing having a diagnosis can help you get help and treatment and figure out how to address the problem. So my next one is that people with Tourette syndrome can't live normal lives. That's just not true. I mean, for some, it can be very hard. It can be disabling. But there are people with Tourette syndrome who have very rich, fulfilling lives. After that, I have Tourette syndrome is debilitating. Similar to that, for some people, it very much is. It is considered a disability and is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I've never considered it a disability personally, but it is for some people, not for everybody, but under the category it is. Another misconception is that Tourette syndrome is caused by stress or bad parenting or an unhappy childhood, and that is simply not true. Although stress can make tics worse, Tourette syndrome is hereditary. It is genetic, even though we don't know the exact cause. We know that it is a neurodevelopmental disorder that is passed down. My next myth is that tics only occur in children. No, it's not true. They can persist into adulthood, but for some people, they can cease after childhood, but not for all. My next one is that people with Tourette syndrome have mental illness. Now, Tourette syndrome is actually not classified as a mental illness. It's a neurodevelopmental or neurological movement disorder. However, if you have Tourette syndrome, you can also have comorbid mental illnesses. But Tourette syndrome itself is not a mental illness. My next one is that people with Tourette syndrome are intellectually disabled or not as intelligent as others. I don't want to say a cuss word. This is bullcrap. It's not true at all. There's no evidence, there's no research saying that people with Tourette syndrome are less intelligent than people who don't have Tourette syndrome. However, again, that doesn't mean they're disabled or intellectually disabled. However, you can have learning disabilities with Tourette syndrome. That doesn't mean you have an intellectual disability just because you have a learning disability. My next one, I hope I have time, is that tics can only be relieved by medication. I'm going to talk about treatment of tics maybe in the next few weeks, who knows. And I'll talk more about that later, but no, this is not true. Tics actually not always are relieved by medication. It took me quite a while to figure out mine, but there's something called comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics that helps people with Tourette syndrome, and I'll get more into that another time, but that can help with Tourette syndrome, and it's not medication. Moving forward, so the next myth is that suppressing one tic can actually trigger more. I don't know where this came from, but that is not true. Actually, it's quite the opposite. Suppressing your tics can not lead to an increase in tics, and it can actually help you decrease them. My next misconception is that only white people have tics. This is definitely not true. So there is not a good representation of Tourette syndrome in non-white people in the media. It's, from what I've seen, it's all white people. And I know it is genetic and it is inherited, but that's not to say that someone who is not white cannot have Tourette syndrome, because I know people who have Tourette syndrome that are not white. But the majority of people with Tourette syndrome are white. Doesn't mean they're all white. My next one is that you cannot have a job living with Tourette syndrome. I have a job. I have Tourette syndrome. That's not true. Some people have a hard time maintaining jobs or finding jobs, but that does not mean that everybody with Tourette syndrome cannot have a job. My next one is that people with Tourette syndrome cannot be athletes. Same thing, just simply not true. I've actually, for some people, I know that athletics, exercise, sports can suppress tics or just really help alleviate them as well. My next misconception is that Tourette syndrome gets worse as you age. Although this is not typical, well, it can get worse, but for the most part, that is not true. Although it can persist into adulthood, it doesn't mean it gets worse. It usually gets worse before it gets better, but it won't always get worse for everybody. It really just depends on the person and the severity. My next myth is that everyone with Tourette syndrome has the same tics. That's not true. Anything and everything, in my opinion, can be a tic, because it's just anything I've ever seen, said, heard, or done can be a tic. There's a lot of common tics like barking, this type of noises, and like head jerks and stuff. Those are common, but not everyone has them. My next one is that Tourette syndrome disappears in sleep. I thought this one, actually. I thought this for my entire life. So actually, Tourette syndrome doesn't. Tics don't disappear in your sleep. They're significantly diminished. Now, I wouldn't know because I'm asleep. And when I'm asleep, most other people are asleep. But they don't actually go away. They're just significantly diminished. I thought that was very interesting. And my last one, I think I already mentioned this actually. Tourette syndrome is disabling. Now, it can be disabling, is what I'm trying to say. For a lot of people, it's not. But for a lot of people, it is. Because, like I said, even though people with Tourette syndrome can get jobs, it's very hard for some to maintain jobs, maintain relationships, go to school, not disrupt others. There's a lot that goes along with it. So it can be disabling, and some people with Tourette syndrome, severe enough, will have to rely on disability. And I have a lot of opinions on how that works, not for the people who are living on disability, but how much they're getting in disability. But I'm not going to get political or problematic. So my hope is that everyone can take from this that all of these are just myths and they do not apply to everybody, and that we should always continue to do our own research and further investigate, whatever we want. And for me, that is Tourette syndrome. And I really hope y'all enjoyed that, and I hope y'all have a wonderful week. Have a great day.